Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Libertarianism, the philosophy of personal and economic freedom, has deep roots in Western civilization and in American history. In fact, the Washington Post in 2013 used the headline, "Libertarianism is hot." And now we have Senator Rand Paul stating that the Libertarian Movement has arrived and he's running for President of the United States in 2016. So we're very pleased to introduce our guest author, David Boaz, who has written The Libertarian Mind, a Manifesto for Freedom, which one reviewer suggests was his guide to the history, economics, and politics of freedom. Welcome to our show, David.
Thank you.
David Boaz is Executive Vice President of the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and in the Los Angeles Times. His other books include The Politics of Freedom and The Libertarian Reader. In his book, David Boaz argues that we should be free to live our lives as we choose, so long as we respect the equal rights of others. Well, David, do you think the civil liberty abuses after 9/11 in 2002 and the bailouts and out-of-control spending after the financial crisis in 2008 basically propelled the libertarian movement forward in the United States?
Yes, I think that's a lot of what has caused what I think is a surge of libertarian attitudes among the American people and the libertarian movement. The Patriot Act, the things we have more recently found out about surveillance and spying on the American people, and then the creation of the financial crisis and the reaction to that, the Washington bailouts, the bailouts of Wall Street, of the big banks, the bailouts and essentially the nationalization of the automobile industry. I think all of those things have pushed people to be more skeptical of the scope and power of government.
So I think the libertarian movement has really grown a lot since 2008, don't you think?
Yes, I think that's right. And one of the ways I explain that is to say in 2008 there was no national libertarian student organization. And now there are two. There's Students for Liberty and Young Americans for Liberty.
Interesting. And where are they based? I mean, what universities?
Well, they're based at hundreds of universities, but they have national offices here in the Washington area.
Interesting. Well, you wrote in your book that in the latest Gallup governance survey finds 30 to 40 million Americans hold libertarian views. I mean, do you have other polls to cite that would suggest that there are more Americans that identify themselves as libertarians?
Well, there's a couple of different things there. The word libertarian doesn't get used that much, and therefore if you go around asking people, how would you describe your political views, not many are going to say libertarian, 2, 3, 5%.
Okay.
But if you ask people questions about the role of government, you can then find, Gallup finds 23% of the American people give libertarian answers. David Kirby and I did surveys that we published in a paper called The Libertarian Vote, and we found 13 to 15% because we had a tougher standard for what constituted a libertarian.
Okay.
So whichever one of those you use, you are talking about tens of millions of Americans who generally think government should stay mostly out of the economy and mostly out of your personal life.
I see. Well, you also, in this book, covered a lot of history of libertarian thinking and thoughts and philosophy. And you wrote that the globe's relatively higher standard of living is fairly new. And can you elaborate? Because that had an impact on people with growing economic independence.
Sure. If you think about the history of the world in sort of economic terms, for centuries and even millennia, the world was essentially poor. You had to work from dawn till dusk to make a subsistence level income. Life expectancy was short. If you got sick, you were likely to die. I went to Vanderbilt University, so I kind of studied Vanderbilt history. George Vanderbilt was one of the richest men in the world around 1900. He built the biggest house in America. It's a fabulous place to visit in North Carolina. And he died at 52 of an ailment that, you could cure at a mini clinic today.
Yes.
So all those kinds of things mean until around 1700, when libertarianism, which was then just called liberalism, and capitalism came into the world, things had not changed all that much. I read an article once that said if Cicero had left the Roman Republic and visited Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, he would have found the world pretty much the same.
Okay.
You're writing with a quill pen by candlelight. But 100 years after that, and now 200 years after that, the world is totally different because we've had free markets and freedom.
Yes, yes. Who are the key thinkers and writers from the past who developed libertarian views?
Well, I think probably the most prominent and original is John Locke. Everybody reads John Locke in college. He is kind of the fundamental thinker of Western civilization. His emphasis that the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and property. That's why we want to have a government.
Now, John Locke is a Brit, right?
John Locke is British, that's right. Adam Smith, who was Scottish, is another person who described the economic system of a free society. Free markets let people make their own decisions. He called it the simple system of natural liberty. Then you have the American founders, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and a constitution that limits the power of government. And then through the 19th, 20th century, you've got John Stuart Mill and Herbert Spencer, the abolitionists who are essentially making libertarian arguments against slavery, the 20th century economists like Hayek and Friedman, a long list of people, and I do cover
and which is
a lot of them in Chapter 2.
Which is great. Let's fast forward to modern times. What do you think are the key reasons behind the Tea Party's ascension in American politics?
Well, the key reason behind the Tea Party is the financial crisis and the bailouts and the subsidies and the Obamacare that followed along. Under President Bush, federal spending increased by $1 trillion during his term. And then we had the financial crisis, and over the sort of year and a half when Bush gave way to Obama, another $1 trillion increase in spending. So
under Obama?
Well, it happened starting with Bush because TARP was a $700 billion spending program passed under Bush.
Yes.
So yes, that whole September 08 to September 09, a huge increase in federal spending. And that's what caused people to start holding marches. Really, you could say the first moment of the Tea Party was the week that President Bush asked the House of Representatives to pass his $700 billion Wall Street bailout, and the phones rang off the hook on Capitol Hill, and they didn't do it. They turned it down. Now, after that, the Federal Reserve Chairman and the President beat them up, and they changed their minds and they passed it. But to me, that's the day the Tea Party starts, is the day the American people spontaneously erupted against this massive bailout.
Yes, yes. Also, Senator Rand Paul's efforts in the U.S. Senate and his presidential campaign are generating attention for libertarian ideas. I mean, what do you think are Senator Paul's 3 most popular libertarian views?
Well, I would say that he offers a libertarian-ish. He never calls himself a libertarian. He says he's libertarian-ish.
Because he's a Republican.
And he's a Republican, that's right. But you can be a libertarian Democrat, a libertarian Republican, whatever. But he says libertarian-ish. So he's libertarian-ish on taxes and spending and regulation. He thinks they're all too high and he wants to reduce them. He's libertarian-ish, I think, on foreign policy. He thinks we've gotten involved in too many foreign wars and we ought to be more cautious and prudent about deciding when to go to war.
Well, this is my follow-up question because lately Senator Paul is adopting a more muscular posture on defense and foreign policy, and it seems like now he's ready to commit U.S. troops abroad more.
Everybody who runs for president moves to the center or to the center of their party or something. It's true that right now he's been talking up the muscular aspects of his foreign policy. He always believed in a strong national defense. He would say a national defense second to none. He just thought we should be cautious about where to intervene overseas. I think that he played a role in preventing us from going to war in Syria a couple of years ago.
You think so?
He tried to stop our bombing of Libya, which has worked out so well. They got rid of Gaddafi, and now they have chaos.
Yes.
He has said, given that we already have people in Iraq and ISIS is doing terrible things to even Americans who are there, we have to respond to that. But I think you will see that around the world, he is the senator least likely to want to engage in conflict if it can be avoided, and he also wants Congress to play its constitutional role. If we're going to go to war, Congress should authorize it. It shouldn't be one man's decision.
Yes, yes. Well, that's very interesting. Now, I'm going to switch topics now from foreign policy to capitalism. What is crony capitalism, and why is it a political target for people across the political spectrum?
You know, in a way, it shouldn't even be called crony capitalism. It should be called just cronyism or crony statism or whatever. Because, in my view, in a real capitalist economy, everybody has to compete. And you have to compete for the favor of customers.
Okay.
And if you create a bookstore or a television show or a restaurant or an automobile company that can't attract customers, then you go out of business. That's what capitalism is. Cronyism is when you use your access to government to be able to make money or stay in business when the consumers don't want to give you that money. And so you have firms that get tariffs to prevent foreign competition.
Okay.
You have firms that get bailouts. You know, some people say we've bailed out Citicorp and Goldman Sachs 5 times over the past 30 years.
Wow.
That's real cronyism.
That is.
Even on a very local level. The taxi cartel, you know, you have to get a license to run a taxi.
Yes.
And now Uber and Lyft are coming along, and they're challenging this cartel. They're the capitalists, and the taxi cartel is the cronies.
And the prices drop for people taking a cab ride, right, because of Uber.
And more importantly, service has gotten better, including safety. You know, one thing people worry about, well, we don't know who these drivers are with Uber, but we do. The company database knows their name, it knows where they picked you up, it knows who you are, it knows whether you got where you were going. Okay. That's more than any cab company knows.
That's right. Well, let me switch to another topic that's of interest. What do libertarians think about marijuana legislation and same-sex marriage?
Well, those are different topics.
All right, let's talk. Let's talk with marijuana.
But in general, as a libertarian, I would say adult individuals have the right to make the important decisions about their own lives, and that includes if you want to drink alcohol, if you want to drink a big soda, they don't want you to do that in New York City.
Right.
If you want to smoke marijuana, that should be your decision. Rules are different for children. And we have rules about driving under the influence of alcohol that would apply to other drugs as well. But if you want to drink alcohol or smoke marijuana and you're an adult, then I think you should be able to make that decision.
Okay. And then what about same-sex marriage?
Well, a lot of libertarians would say, and I even wrote an article about this myself, why is marriage part of the government at all? Why don't we just privatize marriage? You want to get married, you sign a contract.
Okay.
And if you want your marriage solemnized in your church, then you go and get a church wedding. And if all you want is a wedding out on a meadow in front of your friends, you can do it that way too. You have the legal contract. But we're not in a world where that's going to happen anytime soon. And so libertarians typically say, if the government is going to have marriage licenses, then it should hand them out on an equal basis to heterosexual and homosexual couples.
Okay.
And so I'm in favor of equal freedom to marry.
Interesting. Okay. Now, you wrote in the Libertarian Mind that in 2 presidential campaigns, Congressman Ron Paul of Texas, who is Senator Rand Paul's father, attracted hundreds of thousands of followers. What do you think will be his legacy?
Well, I think one of his legacies obviously is that partly because of the internet, he was able to attract all of these people, especially young people, to a message of smaller government, sound money, not the Federal Reserve, which is a very important issue for him, and staying out of foreign wars. And so while there are issues that I might disagree with Ron Paul or Rand Paul on those 3 big issues, which is what Ron Paul talked about, he attracted I think more than 1 million people to an email list. They were all over the internet, young people. And of course, it's possible someday that his legacy will be that he was the father of Rand Paul, who became president.
Right. Senator Rand Paul has joined Senator Patrick Leahy, who's a Democrat from Vermont, to introduce legislation to limit the use of mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Is this a libertarian position to limit mandatory sentencing laws?
Yes, I think it's generally a libertarian position to say things shouldn't be criminal unless they involve hurting other people.
Okay.
Rape, robbery, murder, theft, those kinds of things should be criminal acts. But smoking marijuana, selling marijuana, selling loose cigarettes on the streets of New York, running a lemonade stand, those kinds of things shouldn't be illegal. And so the first libertarian point is let's make fewer things illegal, make fewer things criminal. A second point is we put people in jail for too long for minor offenses.
Yes.
And that's where Rand Paul and Patrick Leahy have come together. And Rand Paul has also joined with Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey on some criminal justice reform legislation. So that is clearly one of the areas where Paul is leading in a libertarian direction.
Wonderful.
Put fewer people in jail and for less time.
Wonderful. Now, what are your views on compulsory vaccination laws? I mean, right now, of course, people are concerned because the small child is getting so many vaccinations that are required, and so what is the libertarian view on that?
Well, I don't think we actually have compulsory vaccination laws now. Schools often have requirements that if you're going to our school, you must get these vaccinations.
But isn't that a public school, though?
Yeah, but you could go to a private school, or you could go to a public school in a different jurisdiction or something. So it's not exactly mandatory, even though it comes close enough that almost everybody does it. But as you know, there was a controversy a few months ago when it was discovered that particularly in California, there were a lot of parents who were skeptical about the effects of vaccines, and they were not getting their kids vaccinated. So I guess the first thing a libertarian would say is we don't have compulsory vaccination laws now. We don't need any more compulsory vaccination. I think it's reasonable for schools to say, you want to come to our school, you have to get vaccinated. We don't need 100% vaccination to get the herd effects, the community effects of vaccination.
Okay.
And in general in America, we are getting those community effects because of the large number of people who get vaccinated.
Right.
But my advice to people is get your kids vaccinated.
Okay. Do you think Ronald Reagan would be considered a libertarian today?
When I was in college at Vanderbilt University, Ronald Reagan came shortly after he left the governorship, before he started running for president, and one of the things he said in his speech was the heart and soul of conservatism is libertarianism. Now, a lot of libertarians objected to that because they said he's no libertarian, he's just a conservative.
Right.
He believes maybe in a free market economy, but he's in favor of the drug laws, he's certainly not in favor of gay rights, and he's in favor of a hawkish, militaristic foreign policy, so he's not a libertarian.
Right.
However, if you look at a lot of his rhetoric, if you watch his famous 1964 speech or his 1981 inaugural speech, he's talking about the dangers of big government, the benefits of free markets, the benefits of individual liberty and individual responsibility.
And he lowered taxes, which was...
And he did lower taxes. And more than lowering taxes, I think, he brought back a respect for entrepreneurship and the free market and success in the market and individual initiative. And I think he and Margaret Thatcher together kind of revived that entrepreneurial spirit.
They did. Now, what is your opinion of Obamacare?
I'm against it.
Do you think, though, that there will be any changes? I mean, a lot of people have signed up, and a lot of people were not insured. And
this is a problem. Once you get people hooked on a government program, it's very difficult to reverse them. But, I wrote about this topic 17 years ago, how we got into our health care problems by having too much government involvement. When somebody else is paying for your health care, you don't care what it costs. And that means prices rise. If every time you bought a car, you were indifferent to the cost, what would happen to the cost of cars? They would go up. And so we need to get people with skin in the game back in the healthcare system. You should be thinking like a consumer when you ask a doctor, how come this procedure costs more here than it did for my friend? With her doctor. That's the kind of pressure you want. We weren't getting that. And then I looked at what I wrote 17 years ago and I realized everything I wrote is still true. We just went a little farther in the wrong direction. Now even more people are going to have the government paying for their health care, meaning they will be indifferent to costs. And what happens when people are indifferent to costs is the costs rise, and then the people in charge, like the bureaucrats or the employers, look for a way to cut costs, and that creates rationing and scarcity and things that you don't want.
Right. Well, of course, you can see the government abuses with the Veterans Administration, all the money that's been wasted. And
Right. So if you want to turn the whole country into the Veterans Administration, then keep going in this direction.
It's frightening. Well, do you think there will be a libertarian political party as a third party in American politics after 2016?
Well, there already is a Libertarian Party. It's been around for about 40 years. In fact, possibly the proudest moment of the Libertarian Party is their very first campaign, when they ran a woman as their vice presidential nominee, and she became the first woman to receive an electoral vote in American history. But it turns out it's very difficult to get a third party off the ground. Americans don't like third parties, and the political system is stacked against them. So yes, I believe the Libertarian Party will still be around, but it will still find it extremely difficult to struggle against the establishment. But let me say this. If the Democrats and the Republicans nominate the former president's wife to run against the former president's brother, I would like to be running a third-party candidate at that moment.
Okay, so anything's possible, right?
Yeah.
Now, why do libertarians support an individual's right to own firearms? Should there be any restrictions at all on gun ownership?
Well, the first answer to why do we support that right is because we support freedom. And if you want to abridge people's freedom, you have to make a good case for it, and I don't think the case for banning firearms is good enough. It is important for people to be able to defend themselves. It is, in the broadest sense, important for the people to be armed as well as the government. I certainly hope it will never be the case in the United States that we would want to use our guns against the government. But our ancestors did, and people in some countries do, and so the reason we have the Second Amendment is because it's part of a free society that people have the right to keep and bear arms. But it is also true that I support the right to keep and bear arms because it's in the Constitution, and I support the freedoms protected in the Constitution.
Okay. Now, according to your book, libertarians stress property rights, but the air and bodies of water are common to all. I mean, do libertarians support government regulation of the resources? I mean, how do they feel about environmental protection?
Well, I think that's a real challenge. Yes, we do support property rights, and we think that without property rights, we would still be living in desperate poverty. I mean, desperate poverty you can't imagine if we truly had no property rights.
Right.
It is property rights that allow each of us to decide, I'm going to build something, I'm going to improve something. If I own this field, then I don't want to exhaust the field. I want to rotate the crops, that sort of thing. If I didn't own it, then I wouldn't care. If I were given access to a government forest, I would cut down all the trees. If I have my own forest on my own land, then I only cut down some trees each year so it can keep producing trees. The challenge is, how can we make that work to protect air and water? In the 19th century, there was a general property rights understanding of water, that you can't put dirt in my water and you can't take the water stream that I am accustomed to, that I have a property right in. Air is even more difficult than water. But what we want to look for is ways to decentralize these answers. We don't need one national answer for every environmental problem.
Well, maybe via the states, I suppose, maybe.
Via the states, even communities. Los Angeles might need different rules from what they need in the San Francisco Bay Area. So we may need some environmental regulations, but we should be looking for answers based in private property, free markets, and decentralization.
Well, I'm curious, now where do libertarians come down on something like abortion?
I think libertarians can come down in different places on that. Libertarians believe the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and property. So if you focus on life, you might be a pro-life libertarian. If you focus on liberty, you're going to say it's the woman's liberty to decide.
So either side, you could be.
I think you can be. I would say that 2/3, 3/4 of libertarians are pro-choice, but a not insignificant number are pro-life. And I find that pro-life and pro-choice libertarians can talk to each other more civilly than a lot of pro-choice and pro-life activists, because we understand how you could come to the other conclusion.
Interesting. Now, do libertarians believe children are competent to exercise the same rights as adults? I mean, do libertarians support parental control of children?
I would say children have some rights. You can't kill them, you know, those kinds of things. But no, they're not competent to exercise the same rights as adults. I don't think any political philosophy has a perfect answer to how you deal with children. But I think it's reasonable, for instance, to say that we don't let children drink alcohol or smoke marijuana. We don't let small children sign contracts. Now, at what point does that change? Does it change when you're 14 or 18 or 21? There's no clear philosophical answer to that. So in general, yes, I think parents should make decisions for their children rather than a vast bureaucracy.
Yes. Now, as a libertarian, do you think immigration should be controlled by the federal government?
Well, immigration is going to be controlled by the federal government one way or another. In the 19th century, there really weren't any immigration restrictions. You know, I hear a lot of people say, my ancestors came here legally. Well, there were no laws in the 19th century, so of course they did. Lots of Irish people, lots of Jewish people late in the 19th century. They didn't have to get permission. They didn't have to wait in line. So, in general, I'm in favor of more immigration. I'm in favor of more liberal immigration rules. I think it's reasonable to want to know whether criminals are coming in, terrorists are coming in. But immigrants are good for this country. I was watching the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness this spring, and I noticed only in America an Egyptian Jewish owner hires a Mexican jockey to win the Kentucky Derby.
That's right, only America. And now what about the minimum wage? I mean, what is the libertarian view about the minimum wage being increased?
The libertarian view is that supply and demand is a fact of life. And if you set a minimum price for anything, there will be less demand for it. If you set a minimum price for hamburgers of $10, then McDonald's would be in trouble. Nobody would want to buy a McDonald's hamburger for $10. You might go buy a fancy gourmet hamburger for $10,
right,
but you're not going to buy a McDonald's hamburger after that. And similarly, if somebody's skills are worth $7 an hour and you set a minimum wage of 10 or 15, then who's going to hire that person who's only right now worth $7 an hour? Now, most people who get a job at $7 an hour get better. They learn how to be punctual, how to show up for work, how to run a cash register, and then they get raises and they get better jobs. So what I don't want to do is cut off the first leg on the ladder.
And I want you to tell our viewers where they can find your book in Arlington.
You can find the book at any good bookstore or online service. At my organization's website, cato.org/libertarianmind, you can find links to a lot of the bookstores and book services that have it.
And real quickly, are you your organization publishes a lot of books, doesn't it?
We do. The Cato Institute publishes books on a wide variety of policy topics. We just published one about free speech in the light of the Charlie Hebdo and Danish cartoonist issue. We published books on the financial crisis and, of course, books on libertarianism.
Well, it's wonderful. Well, it's been great having you here on the Bookman's Corner. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
And please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. Thanks for watching. I'm Lois Lindstrom.